Hey, Robert.
Hey, Yaron.
So as you can tell, I'm traveling up in Colorado. So there's so much going on right now, particularly with AI. And then I was reading a story today about autonomous taxis in San Francisco and how there's a massive effort to try to shut them down at kind of all levels of local governments, because they've been experimenting with driverless taxis in San Francisco for months now, with what look like amazing results. But people always bring up but what if? I mean, it's kind of a scary technology, cars driving by themselves. What if? I mean, there's all these negative outcomes that one could imagine, that one could fantasize about, and more people are using that imagination to want to shut down new technologies, and AI is probably the place where we're seeing it most right now.
Definitely. With autonomous vehicles, I was a Tesla driver for a long time, and very quickly, it was the first time I ever felt comfortable turning over control to the vehicle, because very quickly it became obvious that the car was a better driver than I was. And so
I've driven with Robert, so I can testify.
Yes, you can attest to that bar is not extraordinarily high, but
Right.
not sure that the average driver is that much better than I am.
Yep.
And so, if you set the bar at zero risk, which is an easy place to set it, and there's a tendency when you're anti something to set it there, then you've just made it clear that there is no discussion, there is no evaluation of trade-offs or costs and benefits going on, because nothing is zero risk. And I would assert we should set the bar at the median driver. You might argue we should set the bar even higher, because the worst drivers, if they were to not drive, you might reduce accidents by 80%, fatalities by 90%. Like, they're huge upsides to having autonomous vehicles, and that people would go out and protest against them and try and stop that from happening. It's mind-boggling to me, because one, today autonomous vehicles would be better than most drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Two, in 10 years, autonomous vehicles will probably have almost no accidents if we get on the Ingenuism cycle of learning what the remaining problems are. So if you insist you get to zero problems, you never get to zero problems, because the only way to get to a point where major airlines never crash or never have fatal crashes is to learn what the most I don't know what the right word is, but the last problems that we're going to be able to solve, to figure out what they are and then to solve them.
And of course, with airlines, they went through decades and decades of having major crashes and learning and learning and learning, to the point where today it's unbelievably rare. And in the United States, basically zero, crashes with fatalities. It just doesn't happen. And when it does, it's extraordinary.
Well,
but that could have never been achieved.
The last fatal crash by a major U.S. airline, it was 2001. It was after 9/11, which I would count. But basically, there's been one in the last 25 years and zero in the last 20 years. And if you think about the beginning of airplanes, they were insanely risky. It was like going into space now. You were off the ground with no parachute. But that track is necessary for you to eventually figure out how to get to what is virtually zero risk, but is in a practical sense zero risk. I consider flying, to from a practical standpoint, to be zero risk. And we
didn't feel like that landing in Aspen yesterday, when the plane bouncing around all over the place. But yeah, I mean, I kept having to tell myself, it's zero risk, it's zero risk.
And I'd like to be able to tell myself the trip to the airport and from the airport is zero risk, but that would be fantasy. It's not. And with autonomous vehicles, it definitely could be.
So there's a term for this idea that we should strive for zero risk, and it's called the precautionary principle. The idea that as long as you can imagine a significant risk, but imagine it, not even it exists in reality, then we should be very cautious in introducing these technologies, or actually not introduce them at all. And I've heard arguments, for example, about AI that, look, the risk, there might be a very small risk that the AI will take over and kill us all. But the outcome is so devastating, a small risk multiplied by an infinitely damaging outcome says, don't do it. We shouldn't even try. And it's that kind of attitude that is driving, I think, a lot of the panic around AI, and driving a lot of the talk about slowing down, shutting it down even, and certainly a lot of the talk about regulating it.
Well, when you have if you believe that something threatens all of humanity, it's natural to say we need to not do that.
Mm-hmm.
And since the future is unknowable, it's always going to be probabilistic. And I think we're fooling ourselves if we say there's no chance that AI would go horribly wrong and end up eradicating the human race. I mean, it just is. Just like nuclear power, there was a chance that we would have a major, and there still is a chance that we have a major nuclear that would lead to a nuclear winter that would, eradicate most or all of humanity. Those are risks. On the other hand, if we stay at our current level of technology, it is a certainty that eventually humanity will be eradicated from the face of the earth. A meteor will hit the earth, or something will happen. And these sort of catastrophes are measured in very long horizons. Like, we're probably not going to have a super volcano eruption this year. We're probably not going to see an asteroid hit the earth this year. It's very, very small. It's less likely than a fatal airplane crash. But over the long haul, there are virtual certainties. And what we miss when we start saying, well, there's an infinite risk on the downside, is that there's an infinite potential gain on the upside, using the same logic of not being in a position where humanity does eventually get eradicated. And that's at the very top level of my objection to the precautionary principle. I don't object to it in principle, but when you try and the principle in principle, but when you try and implement it in practice, I always have two objections. One is, what are we giving up? What are we not going to have going forward? And what kind of risks is that going to allow to propagate forever, as opposed to actually solving them? For example, what if AI were to eliminate the risk of nuclear war? And I'm not claiming that. I'm not saying how that would even happen. I'm just a thought experiment. What if AI were to eliminate a particular type of risk? Well, if you believe AI will be as powerful enough to eradicate humanity, you sort of by definition believe that it would be powerful enough to eradicate some of these risks. And the real ones we should be worried about are the ones that we haven't even thought about, that, whether it's biotechnology or an invasion, who knows what the risks are? They're just uncountable. And that's always the top level analysis that has to be done, is what are we giving up if we suppress this technology? And a good example would be nuclear power. By 100% clear that nuclear power has been suppressed. We're still using the same generators that were built 60 years ago. There's been relatively little innovation on a practical side, basically close to no innovation for commercial power generation, nuclear reactors, and every other technology that existed when nuclear power was young has evolved extraordinarily, has become much cheaper, much more reliable, much more effective. Planes, cars, boats, computers, you name it. And it's all transformed. It's unrecognizable. Factories today would not, you couldn't even put them side by side and say these are the same things compared to factories that long ago. Yet the power plant is the same power plant.
And well, I mean, everything you said there suggests that you don't really believe in the precautionary principle on principle, but it is, the nuclear energy example is a great example, because if you believe, which I don't, but if you believe, as many in our culture do believe, that climate change is an existential threat to humanity that's going to happen very fast and it's really, really dangerous, then you have to look back and say, well, imagine what a better situation we would be in today if we had embraced nuclear energy 60 years ago, allowed it to evolve, allow it to develop. We'd be much, much closer to carbon zero or whatever the target is today than anybody could imagine, because we'd be running so much on nuclear power and safe, cheap, effective, efficient, and we could eliminate the CO2 without upheaval in our lives that is demanded today, because we don't have those nuclear power options. So we took away an option that we didn't even realize we were taking away, because you don't know the risk maybe, but you also don't know the upsides. And here's an upside that nobody forecast 60 years ago, and we're suffering from today. The fact that we didn't engage.
That's a great example, because that fits right in. Is you say nuclear power is risky, and we need to be cautious, and you implement the precautionary principle, and you shut down the whole cycle of innovation, learning, and improvement. And if pick your technology, anything that's been allowed to evolve, if nuclear power had evolved in a similar path, today we would have, the benefits would be extraordinary, because power would be basically free. The developing world would have power that currently they have no easy way to access. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere would be significantly lower, because they would have started dropping decades ago.
Yep.
And this risk that no one was talking about, in fact, back in the day when nuclear power was young, people were worried about a mini ice age that was coming. You go back and look at Time magazine headlines in the 70s, and they were talking about the coming ice age.
Yep.
And so nobody was thinking about global warming, or it was not a commonly recognized risk. And regardless of whether you believe that climate change is an existential risk, there's definitely would be an advantage to having more control over our climate. The planet has warmed, and whether that's desirable or not, you would want to be making those kind of choices. So we'd be wildly richer, and we would have solved a risk that hadn't even been recognized. And that's my concern with any new technology, whether it's biotechnology or AI, that we don't recognize the potential upside, and we suppress it, and then we learn 60 years later that we basically screwed ourselves by that decision. I was worried about it with biotechnology. I'm a lot less worried about it now, because I guess the benefits of biotechnology have become so clear that the idea of putting massive restrictions on it is unpalatable. But that is just, again, proves the point, is when we know that it's going to be a big cost, well, we don't do it. Well, the default assumption should be suppressing AI will have a big cost. Suppressing nuclear power definitely had a big cost.
I think one of the differences between biotech and AI, which I have found shocking, is that when biotech got to the point where it was kind of dicey, right? They were doing things they weren't sure exactly what status they were, and they weren't sure what the consequences were going to be. The industry itself, primarily scientists, got together and at conferences, and they still do, and they said, okay, in these areas, let's slow down a little bit, because there's real risk to human life. There's the real risk, but we're still going to move forward. We're just going to move forward slowly, and we're going to look at the results, just like we argue in Ingenuism. Look at the results, look at where we need to course correct, and so on. And it looks like that has worked, and that while there's major progress in the biotech areas, both in the science and the technology side of it, they haven't crossed any kind of boundaries. With a few exceptions, they haven't really crossed those boundaries that they set as an industry. AI, it seems like this year in particular, seems to have decided that they can't be held, they can't take responsibility for their own actions. And they immediately, the leaders in the field immediately started saying, this is a disaster, what we're going to do, we need the government to stop us, we need somebody to force us to slow down. And it became They immediately went to government to try to solve the problem, which is never a good idea.
It is, I mean, you get a particular result. If you really want to slow innovation, then it's a great idea. It's not clear that it produces any desirable results, but if we centralize and have a completely, government-oriented plan for how AI moves forward, then it'll be like nuclear power. In 60 years, we'll still be using Chat GPT 4.
I think I told you this. I was at a seminar with a bunch of AI CEOs, and that's what they were advocating. They were just saying, let's use the nuclear power model. And I was like, it's insane. Do they know what they're talking about? These are smart people in the industry. It's shocking.
That is depressing, and it's because despite whatever risks there are in AI, and we're not claiming that there aren't any, there are risks that AI will help solve, and maybe they're biotechnology. Maybe there will be a need for AI in order to combat some sort of bioterrorism that happens in the future. We have no idea. But then there's a whole nother level that I object to, which is the whole Ingenuism or the other forms of it that we've really seen just over the past, sporadically over the past couple thousand years. It's not the default environment for human beings. We have no evidence that this is something that we're naturally going to evolve into. Our society that embraces Ingenuism principles, that embraces learning, embraces dealing with failure in a responsible and productive way, all of that, that really puts a high value on connection and on learning. And when you think about how do you really control a technology in service of the precautionary principle, it always involves something in the end that is something like bombing data centers. In the end, it has to be force.
Yep.
And who decides when that force is used? And it seems inevitable that if we move towards that world, that we're sacrificing the core principles of Ingenuism and progress, and that we're going to end up with a world that not only is not AI moving forward, but nothing is moving forward because we are so focused on risks and not looking at the trade-offs.
Yeah, and that is the great danger of institutionalizing a precautionary principle, because that would prevent the advancements of biotech. It would because there are a lot of risks in biotech, a lot of dangerous things that can happen, and we can embrace those risks and work around them and try to control them and learn as we move forward, or we can stop. And stagnation is a recipe for disaster. You either in life, I think you're either moving forward or you're moving backward. It's stopping still is just not an option.
It seems like I always bring up Werner Vinge's books because they seem to always apply as someone with a real precedence. But he wrote a book called The Peace War, and it was a lab. I think it was Livermore in the book. Develops a technology where they can create these bubbles, and the bubbles are, what it turns out is the bubbles freeze time inside of the bubbles, and so you basically take someone and take them out of reality, and you can create these wherever and however you want of different sizes. And so the next thing you have the Peace Authority, which is run by like an administrative assistant that recognized what you could do with this technology, that has bobbled all of the military institutions. And so like if someone launches a missile at you, you just bobble it in midair.
Yeah.
And it drops down. And so they've eliminated all source of resistance because they can just bobble you. And then the story is the bobbles turn out not to be permanent. So you're frozen in time for 60 years or something, and then suddenly the bobble just disappears. And so people are finding themselves, they were flying an airplane and then suddenly they're flying the same airplane, but in different weather because it's 60 years later, it's,
Yep.
but that is the risk, is if you give someone authority to eliminate a certain type of risk, then that same ability to project force could be used to basically take over the world.
Mm-hmm. No, it is scary, but it's inspiring. The technology itself is inspiring. The advancements we're seeing, the potential upside. I mean, we're talking about big potential upsides, but all the little potential upsides of AI are truly stunning, and just improving our lives, and in curing diseases, and finding cures much faster for a lot of the diseases that that kill us, and therefore extending human life. I mean, it's just, the upside is truly amazing.
Yeah, but the first AIs were very narrow focused. They learned to play chess, learned to play Go, and those are games, but there are much more serious games like creating new drugs that cure cancers. And that I think AI is going to be extremely effective at. The large language models, they're absolutely amazing. It's truly astonishing what they can produce. But they are very limited in the sense of, in exactly this way that you would expect if you were using a word, if you're trained on, what word is likely to come next.
Yep.
I teach about venture capital, and one of the basic things in venture capital is to create a capitalization table. And an average undergraduate learns quite easily how to create a capitalization table. It's not that complicated. And so far, I have not been able to get a large language model to create the capitalization table correctly. I'm sure they'll get it because it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But it's the most straightforward of the applications. So it's, and of course it'll give you what a student that didn't spend any time studying, it'll give you something that vaguely includes some dilution and it has some, but it's totally wrong, and it has no idea that it's totally wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the point, is I don't think, my students, if they're totally wrong, they actually know it. They're just hoping to get some points. I have no intuition or evidence that a large language model knows when it's completely wrong. And that's the big difference. And that's why I'm not as worried as some are about AI destroying the world in the next decade. I don't understand consciousness any better than anyone else. But I do think it's unique enough in that I think that there is, by default, there's a large hurdle to get there. You don't have true consciousness in a whole lot of organisms.
Yeah, and it seems to be tied to life and biological processes. We still have no evidence to suggest you can create it without that. So when we start creating AI within brain cells, as some people are working on, maybe then.
I'd be surprised if this is let to run. I'd be surprised if we don't eventually get true generalized artificial intelligence, and then we maybe even get an intelligence explosion, and then maybe we even get eradicated. But the world where we're aiming for the stars and potentially crashing is better than the world where we just stay in the dirt.
Absolutely. That's a great point to end on. All right.